Hi everyone, so I am recording this because I don't trust the Wi-Fi at the school for tomorrow or for Tuesday, and we as teachers have to come in. We're not allowed to work from home, which is fine, but I don't trust the Wi-Fi at the school, especially because there have been a lot of connectivity issues. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't fall behind and that I record a lesson for you to watch, even if the Wi-Fi is out in school. Okay, so I'm going to be using period 6 just because for whatever reason that period is like a few sentences behind where I normally end. So I'm going to be going to period 6. I'm going to be clicking over on classwork, and I'm going to see that I want to go to the last week. And I want to go ahead and I want to open this assignment and open up my 2 Google Docs. One of the Google Docs will be the text. If the text doesn't automatically show your annotations, remember, don't freak out. You might have it in viewing mode and you're just going to have to switch over to editing mode. So you click right here, it's on viewing mode, and you want to click on editing mode and it all pops up. And so because this one is a little bit, because we're a little bit behind in this particular period for whatever reason, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to review this paragraph that we're in. The nation was founded on a conundrum, and then conundrum being a challenging problem or a dilemma. What Mario Cuomo, who was a leader of New York, characterized as community added to individualism. So those 2 things are defining ideals, and those 2 things, community, a sense of community, a sense of belonging to a culture, belonging to an ethnicity, belonging to customs, they conflict. They're in constant conflict with individualism, a sense of independence, a sense of identity in yourself. A sense of personality and individual characteristics. And so historians complain about the rise of a kind of prideful apartheid in America. And when we open up our Cornell Notes Google Doc, we actually unpacked that significantly more. And an apartheid is a system of separation. If the root word is apart, then apartheid is a system of separation, a system of keeping people apart. This was an actual official system in South Africa, but in the U.S., we also had several hundreds of years of slavery, and then that evolved into Jim Crow. The unequal pay, the lack of job opportunities, the housing inequality, the redlining, the voter suppression, the separate but equal, supposedly, schools, etc., etc. So we too have an apartheid. However, that's not what Anna Quinlan meant when she said that historians complain about a kind of prideful apartheid. She meant that this prideful apartheid was proud of being separate from others, proud of being unique. And the things that the historians were complaining that people were clinging to was their ethnicity, their background, and their custom. And the historians claimed, that somehow if you are holding on to your ancestry, if you are holding on to where your family came from, if you are holding on to the customs and traditions of your family, that somehow that's going to undermine the concept of unity, that somehow it would make you less American. You wouldn't be abiding by American customs, quote unquote American traditions. And so Anna Quinlan pushes back on that. And she says that historians are saying that our melting pot, our diversity, undermines our sense of being American. But she says historians must have forgotten the past. And that's like a jab, because it's ironic. The job of a historian is to remember the past, to study the past, to uplift history and teach it to others. And so she says, historians are wrong. historians must have forgotten the past, or they must have gilded it. Understanding that gilded means to cover in gold. So the author is saying that the historians are wrong, that there is no one way of being American, because all these cultures and all these traditions and all these customs are being celebrated by different people on whom this nation was built on. And so when she says that, the historians must have gilded the past, obviously she's not being literal. You can't cover history in gold, but she means figuratively that they're romanticizing the past. They're sugarcoating the past. They're whitewashing history and rewriting it to make us comfortable. And if we remember the TED Talk that we watched, Dr. Jeffries said, Americans hate history, but they love nostalgia. And so she then goes into, several sentences that you really do have to know about New York in order to get it. Remember that she wrote this article in the aftermath of 9/11, right here. And she wrote this article coming from New York as well. And she says she's a product of a mixed marriage. Remember that we talked about a quote-unquote mongrel nation. That she's the product of a mixed marriage across barely bridgeable lines. An Italian girl, an Irish boy. How quaint it seems now, but how incendiary back then. And understanding that word incendiary means to light up. Very similar to the word encender in Spanish, and it means scandalous. So it's very cute now that an Italian girl and an Irish boy were to, got together, but back then it was outrageous. And then she gives a lot of different jargons and colloquialisms to New York that we don't really understand. But there was one thing that I did want to point out, and it was WASP. And WASP means White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This is the stereotypical way to be a quote-unquote American. To be Caucasian, to be descendant to Northern Europeans, and to be a non-Catholic Christian. Okay, that's the quote-unquote, traditional American, and that's what people look for. And as American as apple pie, they mean WASP. And so she asked a rhetorical question. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna annotate that, because she asked a rhetorical question, and we want to unpack that. Do the Cambodians and the Mexicans in California coexist less easily today? Okay, so the rhetorical question is unpacking immigrants today, and then she says, then the Irish and the Italians, like her parents, right, of Massachusetts a century ago. So the immigrants today versus immigrants of yesterday. I'm not going to write 100 years ago. That's fine if we don't do that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that over to my Cornell notes. And what I want to do is I want to write Cambodians, Mexicans, and Irish Italians. And what she's doing is that she's asking a rhetorical question where she's highlighting the immigrants, like we put in the annotation, the immigrants of today are being compared to the immigrants of 100 years ago. And I'm going to put California and Massachusetts. Okay? And so I'm going to go ahead and reread that sentence. Do the immigrants and Mexicans in California coexist less easily? So to coexist, you all know, means to get along. So let's go ahead and let's add that, because we're going to be breaking this up. But then when she says coexist less easily today, let's put that all together. And she's saying to get along less, to fight more. So that's what she's, making a point. A rhetorical question does not necessarily need an answer. She says, you know the answer. Just by asking the question itself, it is meant to provide all of these thoughts and to provoke your inquisitiveness and to challenge what you may think. So she says, do the Cambodians and the Mexicans in California coexist less easily? Do they fight more today than did the Irish and the Italians of Massachusetts a century ago? You know the answer. And the answer is no. The answer is no. So we're going to, sorry, there was a little glitch right there. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to unpack, a little bit about what she's saying. And, she's thinking about who was considered a minority in certain time periods. So we don't necessarily think of Irish and Italians as minorities today. We don't think of them as being un-American in any way today, because they've been here for over 100 years because of the first wave of immigration that happened in the very early decades of the 20th century. There were 2 waves of immigration that came over from Europe. And so by her asking this rhetorical question, what she's doing is comparing the past minorities and their conflicts to the present day minorities and their fighting. So let's go ahead and let's write that down. To the present day minorities and their fighting. Okay, that's ultimately what she's doing, and it's really important that we understand that, because we want to make sure that in Quinlan's article we're picking up on the fact that she's acknowledging anti-immigrant rhetoric, and that she is reckoning. She's even making historians reckon with the fact that, wait a second, we can't romanticize history. We have to acknowledge that who we consider American today came from somewhere else beforehand. And so let's consider them as willing and as capable of being quote unquote American, but in their own way throughout the generations. So she's considering who was thought of as a minority back then, but considered an American several generations later, all the way to today. And the minorities of those times were called racial slurs. They were called ethnic insults, and so they weren't immune to that back then. It's just that 100 years later, we don't see as much of that towards that particular ethnic group or that particular national group. And so she's also pointing out simultaneously, that the minority groups don't get along in the beginning, and she's implying to give it time. And part of, there are a lot of reasons why different minority groups don't get along in the beginning. There might be bitter history between different countries coming from the certain region or continent, and that might be something. It might be a clash of cultures, a clash of religions. There are a lot of different reasons, but we want to go ahead and we want to acknowledge that as well in the beginning. And she is implying to give it time. We are romanticizing. If we're looking back on history the way that these historians and that she's referencing are, then we're not being realistic. We're romanticizing history and the minorities of the past as a way of comparing, as a way of degrading, as a way of looking down on the minorities of the present. So lots to unpack there. And actually, you know, that's not the only rhetorical question that she asks. In the second paragraph, you know, that we're going to be unpacking at the end of this page, you know, let's actually acknowledge that this entire thing right here is one paragraph. And let's go ahead and at the end of the word hostilities, let's click enter, because this is actually two separate paragraphs. It's 2 pages and it's 4 paragraphs in each page. So, and what, you know, my goal is to get us all the way to the second paragraph of the second page. Because we tend to do like, my goal is to, you know, especially with participation, to do 2 paragraphs a day. And so if we miss class Monday or Tuesday, then that way, like, we're not behind, right? And at least we did our 2 paragraphs, even if it was quote unquote asynchronously, whatever. So I would really like to just read this entire paragraph right here. It's filled with rhetorical questions. Let's just go ahead and acknowledge that from the get-go. It's filled with rhetorical questions. And let's go ahead and read it. She ends it with, you know, like, do the Cambodians and the Mexicans in California coexist less easily today than did the Irish and Italians of Massachusetts a century ago? You know the answer. What is the point of the splintered whole? What is the point of a nation in which Arab cabbies chauffeur Jewish passengers through the streets of New York, and in which Jewish cabbies chauffeur Arab passengers too, and yet speak in theory of hatred, one for the other? What is the point of a nation in which one part seems to always be on the verge of fisticuffs with another, blacks and whites, gays and straights, left and right, Pole and Chinese and Puerto Rican and Slovenian? Other countries with such divisions have in fact divided into new nations with new names, but not this one, impossibly interwoven even in its hostilities. And so she, you know, the first thing that we want to do is that we want to acknowledge that we're going to be breaking up, you know, all these rhetorical questions. And remember that rhetorical questions, you know, she's not really looking for an answer. She's not. It is through her questioning that she is challenging us to think about something a little deeper. Through questioning, without providing a statement, without providing declarative or imperative sentences, but rather through her inquisition, rather through her questioning, she's opening our eyes to different things. And so she says, so we want to, you know, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that she's not really looking for an answer. It is her questioning and provoking of thoughts. That is the point. So, you know, we have 3 questions. Let's go ahead and let's break down the first one. So what is the point of the splintered whole? So, you know, whenever you see right here something like, what is the point? It makes you question, like, even if not explicitly, it makes you question if something is even worth putting effort into. And we want to make sure that we, you know, that we acknowledge that. So the first thing is, what is the point of the splintered whole? Let's go ahead and let's write down that question. There you go. And when you have what is the point, the implication of that phrase questions whether or not something is even worth the effort. So we want to go ahead and we want to copy that, and we want to click comment, and we want to click paste. The difference is that the phrase is something that we want to include. The implication of what is the point questions whether or not something is even worth the effort. You know, like, is this worth it? Should we continue? So this this phrase right here that is like, it's actually a juxtaposition. And I'm going to teach that to you later on. But right now, all that you need to know is that it's a contrast, a sharp contrast. Something that is whole means that it is all put together. Something that is splintered, however, is something that has been broken or is in the process of breaking. And so it implies that therefore it's not whole. So this is actually a sharp contrast. And I'll teach you juxtaposition later, I promise. So like we're gonna in one of the seminal documents that we're gonna be reading, we're gonna completely unpack juxtaposition. So it's a sharp contrast between something that is whole and something that is broken or breaking, because we don't know, right? So let's go ahead and let's comment. Let's copy and comment. We want to make sure that we break it down. Splintered whole provides a sharp contrast, okay? And what she's saying here is that a whole unit has been split. Like think about a piece of wood. Because when something is splintered, for example, if you think about what a splinter is, a splinter comes from like a rough part of the wood that hasn't necessarily been like sanded down all the way or broken down all the way, and so it hurts. You know, you run your hand through a seemingly whole, right, piece of wood, and something was jagged, a piece of it was jagged, and it gave you a splinter. And so she's using that analogy to, again, give a metaphor, create an analogy, give a metaphor for our country. Seemingly whole and yet jagged. So we want to make sure that we write that down. Seemingly whole and yet jagged. Analogy. It is an analogy for our nation. And she says, you know, she's again implying that a whole unit has been split, and it has its rough parts because of that, and that there are parts of that are damaging and can hurt. So let me write that down. A whole unit and again, this is a metaphor for America. And ultimately, when she, you know, let's wrap up this question. What she's really asking between the lines of this question, what is the point of a splintered whole? If we understand that the splintered whole is a united nation that is split, that is splintered, then what she's really asking is, you know, what is the point of being one divided nation? That's what she's asking in between the lines. And this isn't a surprise to us because the way that she ends that paragraph about other countries breaking apart over such divisions, again, like reinforces this question that she's asking. And she says, what is the point of a nation in which Arab cabbies and chauffeurs, chauffeur Jewish passengers through the streets of New York, and in which Jewish cabbies chauffeur Arab passengers too, and yet speak in theory of hatred? And so we want to make sure that we understand that when she says that when she says Arab, well, cabbies is, you know, cab drivers that are being put out of business because of Uber and Lyft. But Arab, meaning people from the Arab region, typically of the Muslim religion. I'm going to put typically because not always. From the Arab region. From the Arab nations. Okay. And so Muslims and Jews have centuries, but as well with Christians. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because we're going to discuss this at the end of the week when we start our next text, called Making the Future Better Together. We start unpacking the Nation of Islam. We start unpacking what Muslim is, and how Christianity and Jewishness, how they are part of like the Abrahamic faith. So I'm going to try to not get ahead of myself, but essentially what I'm trying to get to is the fact that there's this hostility between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, and it's over territory, predominantly over a specific site where a wall is built, and what those two religions believe that the site of where that wall has been built, what it means to their respective religions, and also it's currently about Israel and Palestine. And if you can definitely look up more about that on your own. Israel was founded in the 1950s. There was a lot of debate about that, and in 1977, Israel began to annex other parts of Palestine, and has taken over more and more and more parts of what was traditionally Palestine. And so there's a lot of fighting about that. So now put a Muslim and a Jew in the same car together, and again she says, and yet speak in theory of hatred one for the other. And so we want to go ahead and we want to make sure that we put a question there. I'm going to really put it right here. In theory, and more than just theory, in theology. Theology is religion. In theology, these two religions have animosity. I'm not going to say hatred. I'm going to say animosity. Have hatred towards each other. Because there are a lot of Jews that are currently standing up for Palestinians and for Arab people in solidarity, because they acknowledge that Jews have had a history of being persecuted against. And so they are, a lot of Jews are acting in solidarity alongside Muslim people that are being persecuted as well. So in theology, these two religions have animosity towards each other. But then realistically or pragmatically, they work alongside one another every day. So if you notice, Anna Quinlan has a recurring, I'm just going to copy and paste that. Anna Quinlan has a recurring theme in her paragraphs. She talks about the reality of America and the ideal of America. And then here she talks about the reality of these two religions working alongside one another, and yet the theory of them hating one another. So it's just interesting to track that through her writing, because when you notice patterns, it just opens up your eyes more to what's happening in multiple paragraphs just by you noticing patterns. So she's ultimately, we're going to go ahead and we're going to rephrase. We're going to rephrase the question. What is the point of claiming to hate one another? Because of ideological or religious differences, but then work alongside one another all day. And then we're gonna paste our comment, and she gives the example of Jews and Muslim cab drivers and passengers. So what she's really asking is it possible for people to be truly divided, for people to be truly split, if something like this can happen. And so let's go to the last one, the last rhetorical question, I mean. What is the point of a nation in which one part seems to always be on the verge of fisticuffs? Well, first we need to unpack that word. Fisticuffs, you know, like that root right there, fist, and then cuffs right there. So it's about putting your fists up as if about to fight. You know, so always on the verge of fighting. Let's go ahead and let's edit that. Always, that's what she's really saying. Always on the verge of fisticuffs, always on the verge of fighting. Always on the verge of fighting. And then let's just go ahead and let's unpack the different ways in which people are always on the verge of fighting, or the different issues. Blacks and whites. Here she's talking about fighting over race-related issues. Gays and straights. Fighting over sexuality and rights given or taken away based on sexual orientation. And here, when she says left and right, she's not like talking about those two fists that are up. She's talking about left, meaning liberal. I want to start with the L so you can see it. Left, meaning liberal, meaning Democrats. And then right, meaning the opposite of liberal in the political ideologies, are conservative, meaning Republican. Okay. And then obviously all this right here are different nationalities. From different, and you know, this needs to be acknowledged, from different continents throughout the world. Pol means people from Poland, and then obviously like Chinese and Puerto Rico, you know, and Slovenian means from the Slovak Republic. Okay. So this the Slovak Republic and Poland are in this is in Eastern Europe, and Poland as well. Puerto Rico, you know, is part of the Caribbean, and China, you know, part of Asia. And so here, her rhetorical question here is, we're going to rephrase the question because it's helpful. What is the point? What is the point of a nation? Excuse me. Of a nation that is always on the verge of fighting with one another based on their different identities. And then some of the identities that she mentioned was race, sexual orientation. I'm going to put sexual orientation instead of sexuality. Sexual orientation, politics, and nationalities. Okay? Like, ultimately, what's the point? What's the point? You know? And then she kind of like, she doesn't answer it, but again, rhetorical questions are not meant to be answered. Rhetorical questions are meant to provide, like, a provocation of thought about something. So, you know, when she breaks down those rhetorical questions, you know, what's the point of a nation that always seems to be on the verge of race and sexual orientation and politics and nationalities? Other countries with such divisions have in fact divided into new nations with new names but not this one. Impossibly interwoven, even in its hostilities. And I want to go ahead and I want to take that quote and let it be the one that we put in here. Oh, I hate that. Why did it do that? Area 11. I'm sorry. It bothers me. Area 11. Here we go. There you go. So sorry. Impossibly interwoven, even in its hostilities. Just hit me that I'm like here talking to myself. And you guys aren't like, aren't there to like give me your thoughts and your answers. Okay, so impossibly interwoven, even in its hostilities. And, you know, basically, she's saying that other nations have split. Other nations with so many differences have split, have officially split. But we haven't. And we're going to get into that in a moment. I just want to copy, comment, and paste. And we haven't. And you know, I think I'm going to go back up here for a moment. When tragedy strikes, we unite. You know, and this right here, the most pluralistic nation on earth. We're not the largest country in the world, but we are the most diverse. You have to find moments in this piece, in this first page, because it shifts. But you have to find moments in this first piece where you're proud, where you're proud of the accomplishments of people that have worked hard to build this nation. And going back to what Dr. Jeffries said in the TED Talk, you know, he ended that amazing 13-minute TED Talk by saying, this country was built on the shoulders of the political giants like James Madison, you know, the third president of the United States. But this country was also built brick by brick by the hands of enslaved African American children. And it's this idea that as we are acknowledging and reckoning and wrestling with the ugliness of America, that is part of our history, there's also so much to be proud of and to admire through that. And so right here, you know, she has another moment like that. Other countries with such divisions have in fact divided into new nations with new names. And so, you know, I just want us to think for a moment about those countries. I know that answers that students have given typically have been North and South Korea, Israel and Palestine. Like I was talking about earlier, I mentioned that for a reason. The Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. That's in Eastern Europe. Hitler, when he was occupying other nations, he had conquered, you know, I don't want to say peacefully, but the Czech people couldn't fight back because they're they're a small country. They don't have a lot of, they didn't have a large military. They don't put, you know, and even to this day, they don't invest much in a military, and they didn't have the means to fight back. So Hitler threw these two countries together and called them Czechoslovakia. Okay. So, you know, there's, going back to like my point from earlier, there's a sense of pride in being able to stay together as one nation, despite like all the division and the hostilities. You know, there's a sense of pride, in trying to make it work. And, you know, this is a separate thing. It's obviously not part of our text, but I would like to remind you of a James Baldwin quote. James Baldwin said, I love him, and James Baldwin, African-American man, grew up in Harlem, and he left. He left in the 1950s. He left to Paris with $40 in his pocket, and he said, by his own words, he said, I made it to Paris, to the streets of Paris, with nothing more than $40 in my pocket, and on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me here that didn't already happen to me in America. And when the schools began to be integrated, with Brown v. Board of Education, when the schools began to be integrated and he saw the pictures of a young African-American girl integrating a white public high school in the South, and he saw the vitriol and the viciousness of people spitting at her and yelling at her and booing her and throwing things at her and just yelling obscenities. And he saw that picture and he realized, it's time for me to come home. It's time for me to come home. I have to be here. Well, I have to be there to document this. And he's a famous writer. He's taught in so many colleges and universities. Has written so many books. And he said this famous quote, I love America more than any other country in the world. Excuse me, that's misspelled right here. In the world. And because of that, I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually. This is James Baldwin. And it's this notion that if you love something, you don't give up on it. If you love something, you make it work. I would also like to put in like a little asterisk here and be like, this is clearly not for abusive relationships. And that, because this sounds like a bad marriage or something, like you're staying in it for the kids or whatever. This is obviously not for like abusive relationships. And if we're honest, this country has abused undocumented people, has abused, traditionally, historically abused Black people from all over the African and Caribbean diaspora, has abused Hispanic and Latinx people, has abused Asian people. I mean, we were talking about the sweatshops and slaveries that this country has gone through. And so to pretend that it's other, to pretend that that's part of the past is irresponsible. It's educational negligence. Educational malpractice, as Dr. Jeffrey said. So you want to acknowledge the hard things and also see the beauty in a country, see the beauty in a struggle, see the beauty in solidarity. And so there's a sense of pride in trying to make it work. And that's how she ends that particular, not only sentence, but that page. And I wanted to, to just revel in that for a little bit. Now, in the next paragraph, she brings up this word, disparate, which we already know from sentence 1 all the way up top, disparate. We already know that word means separate parts. And once these disparate parts were held together by a common enemy. So no longer was it held together by the notion, like she says up here, held together by a notion, the notion that all men are created equal. I keep bringing you back to other parts of the paragraphs because I want you to see how she brilliantly ties everything together. And so she says that this time, that once, we were held together, not by the notion that all men are created equal, but by a common enemy. Man, I I hope I get to do this with you. Instead of like you guys just watching me do it. So a common enemy. You know, we both have the same enemy. You know, we put aside our differences because we both have a common enemy. So I want to go ahead, I want to click comment, and I want to take that over to my Cornell notes that you all have done such an amazing job in adding to it. Right here, 26, common enemy. Once we were held together, not by the notion that all men are created equal, but by a common enemy. I remember that a common enemy means that we both have the same enemy. When this happens, people tend to put aside their differences and unite in order to defeat that common enemy. Or work together, you know, maybe not like complete unity, but at least work together to defeat that common enemy. So let's find out what the common enemy was. You know, once these disparate parts were held together by a common enemy, by the fault lines of world wars and the electrified fence of communism. So these were the common enemies. World wars and the electrified fence of communism. So the common enemies of the 20th century: World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. Also known as communism. Okay? And those fights happened in North Korea and Vietnam. Or let me put in the parentheses the Korean War, Vietnam, and the Cold War of Russia, or with, you know, against. Russia. I'm going to go ahead and just put communism and communism. Okay? And then here you have the Cold War against Russia. Okay? And all of that happened in the 20th century. So with the end of the Cold War, which happened in 1988 with Reagan, with President Reagan. And so the way, you know, part of what ended the Cold War was that President Reagan came into power, and that the Berlin Wall fell. That's like the simplest explanation that I can give. There were other things, like in the Czech Republic, you know, this country that I was telling you about here that was merged was the Slovak Republic. There were things like the Velvet Revolution that ended the Cold War, and they called it velvet because not a single drop of blood was spilled when their communism ended, and they brought in a democracy. So the Cold War ended in 1988 with the president of, you know, with Reagan coming in as president of the United States, and the tearing, you know, and he said Gorbachev, which was the ruler of Russia at the time, tear down that wall, and he was alluding to the Berlin Wall, which was just something, you know, when you learn about this more, I don't know if it's in your U.S. history in 11th grade or in world history, but if you ever get a moment to watch videos of people tearing down the Berlin Wall, it's like one of those moments that you don't forget. It's like, well, I was I had just been born when that happened. Like, literally, like, days old when that happened. But, like, when you realize that there were families that were separated by this wall, that there were families that were divided by communism, that there were families that grew up on opposite sides of a wall for years, and there were a lot of newspapers and underground radio programs and underground newspapers or pamphlets that were happening in order to try to get information. But if you ever watch a video of ordinary people tearing down the Berlin Wall, it's emotional. It's one of those things that you remember, if you were born at that time, that you remember where you were when. Where were you when JFK was killed? Where were you when you heard that MLK was assassinated? Where were you when something like this, the Berlin Wall was being torn down? Where were you when the Oklahoma City bombing happened? And then, now we're going to get into things a little bit before your lifetime. Where were you when the Twin Towers were hit? I think that for your generation, it's where were you when Parkland happened? For me, it wasn't, for me it was 9/11, and it was also Trayvon Martin. It's those moments. It was also when President Obama declared, like, late at night, that Osama bin Laden had been caught. It's those moments that you remember exactly where you were when you heard the news. So with the end of the Cold War, with the end of it, you have been focused all this time. All this time, you've been focused on a common enemy. You both have your, let's say, your lasers, right? Your little red dot lasers. Let's say that you have your lasers aimed in the same direction. You're standing side by side, aiming your lasers at your common enemy. And with the end of the Cold War, when that common enemy no longer exists, who do you turn your lasers on now? Each other. Each other. Because now that the common enemy no longer exists, and remember that you put aside your differences in order for you to work together to take out that common enemy. And when that common enemy no longer exists, you now go back to your differences. You now go back to turning on one another. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to right here, with the end of the Cold War, copy that, and we're going to paste the end of the Cold War. (1998). It was like October of I'm going to put fall of 1998, with President of the United States Reagan and the tearing down of the Berlin Wall by the, which was in Germany. Just so you know, it was East Germany and West Germany. I'm going to put Democratic Western Germany from communist Eastern Germany. Maybe I should put that as a bullet point, just to keep the integrity of what we wrote in the comment, in the annotation. And so remember, like, differences had been put aside all this time in order to defeat the common enemy. once the common enemy, it has been defeated and no longer exists, the difference is returned, and you go back to turning on each other. Okay? So, with the end of the Cold War, there was a creeping concern that without a focus for hatred and distrust, let's go ahead and let's copy that. Without a focus for hatred and distrust, that is what a common enemy provides. A common enemy provides someone or something for you to focus on, hating and distrusting together. But without that, you go back to hating and distrusting each other. Okay. A sense of national identity would evaporate. So part of what happened was that people would, because they put aside because they had to fight a Cold War, because they had to fight a world war, because they had to fight a war against communism or a war against fascism, with World War I and World War II. Because they had a war to fight, you had Black people, white people, Asian people, Hispanic people, or Latinx people. You had them fighting together. Like, imagine that we're talking about, war, and we're talking about infantries, and we're talking about, like battalions, and you have people of all different kinds of races, ethnicities, nationalities, classes, and they are fighting alongside one another. And they had a national identity. Like, we are on the same team. We are American first before we are our race. We are American first before we are our gender. American first before our ethnicity, our original, our ancestral nationality. We are American first. There was a national identity. Okay? So let's go ahead and let's break that down. National identity. A sense of national identity would evaporate. And that national identity was produced by a focus on a common enemy. American first. Okay? Let's say a sense of being American first before a sense of any other kind of identity. Copy, comment, and paste. So a national identity was produced by a focus on a common enemy, a sense of, and then let's unpack that a little bit. A sense of being American first before any other kind of identity. You have soldiers fighting alongside people they would ordinarily not mingle with or not have the opportunity to meet. Soldiers fighting alongside people they would ordinarily not mingle with or have the opportunity to meet. And working towards towards the goal. I don't want to say common goal. I'm working towards the goal of eradicating the common enemy. Okay? So you have people of different races, ethnicities, ancestral nationalities, genders, and even sexual orientations. Like if that was something that would be disclosed. Considering themselves Americans first as they fight in a war together. Okay, but here's where the evaporate part comes up. To evaporate means to disappear, ultimately. Like, that's what it means. I guess we can talk about like steam and evaporation and all this stuff, whatever. But ultimately, it means to disappear. Okay? And then what exactly would disappear? What would disappear is a sense of national identity. Okay? National identity would disappear. And what does that mean? So then this right here is super interesting. That the left side of the hyphen. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put left in red. Okay? At the left side of the hyphen. African American, Mexican American, Irish American would overwhelm the right. Okay? And what she means is the right side of the hyphen. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to make it blue. Notice that it always ends with American. Oh shoot, what did I do? I don't want to highlight. I want to change the color of the font. Okay? I'm going to copy that because I'm not doing this color thing all over again. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to put it here. Okay? Change the font because it bothers me. To whatever it is that you have it to. That the left side of the hyphen, African American, Mexican American, Irish American would overwhelm the right side of the hyphen. And so if you notice, no, don't make it blue permanently. Let me just change the color. Okay, good. So the left side of the hyphen is really talking about your ethnicity, your culture, your race, your ancestral background, right? The left is about your cultural, racial, ancestral background. The right is focusing on current nationality as an American. Okay? I also would like to point out that notice how, white Americans don't have a hyphen. They're just considered American. And again, it's that idea of who is considered, quote unquote, American. Okay? Who has the right to be considered American and to not be questioned. To not be questioned if they love this country. to not be questioned if, you know, if they're fighting for this country, to have to prove time and time again that they are quote unquote American enough. You know, how many generations back can you prove that your family goes? And it's like, why does that even matter? So it's like African Americans. And I just want to, you know, point out African Americans, you know, descendants of enslaved people brought to America. And I want to point out that Mexican Americans, descendants of people already residing in North America, separated by a border. I'm not talking about a wall, I'm talking about a border. Okay, like, and when you study things like the Louisiana Purchase, when you study things like the Spanish-American Civil War, when you study things like there are a lot of things that happen in American history that determines, you know, what countries are territories. Do they have autonomy and authority over themselves? Where do we draw the line between the West and, you know, what belongs to France, what belongs to Spain, what belongs to Mexico, and what belongs to America as it is continuing to expand? So descendants of people that, you know, of people already residing in North America, separated by a border. And then Irish Americans, descendants of people willingly, because remember, African Americans involuntarily, willingly or voluntarily came here, migrated here. Okay, so I want you to notice, like, and I'm gonna keep hyphening that a little bit so that the color can like stay the same, so that you can see the left and the right. So I'm gonna quote this because it deserves to be quoted. It comes straight from the text. So if you notice, the left side is the cultural, racial, ancestral background, African American, being descendants of enslaved people who were involuntarily kidnapped, captured and kidnapped and brought to America. Mexican American, descendants of people that were already here, already residing in North America, that were separated by a border. And then Irish American, descendants of Europeans, of people who voluntarily migrated here, emigrated here. So this fear that without a common enemy, the left side of the hyphen would overwhelm your sense of being American. And that's ultimately what she's getting to. Without, oh, excuse me. I'm gonna move this down just a little bit. Without a common enemy, this idea that the left side of the hyphen, and I'm not going to repeat that the cultural or ancestral background would overwhelm the quote-unquote American sense of identity, of national identity. That somehow, without having a common enemy to focus on, people would not feel as American because they're not fighting for their patriotism in some way. away is war. And slow-growing domestic traumas like economic unrest and increasing crime seemed more likely to emphasize division than community. Today, the citizens of the United States have come together once more because of armed conflict and enemy attack. Terrorism has led to devastation and unity. So here, domestic traumas that they domestic traumas being like civil rights, women's rights, anti-war movements, the economic recession that happened, it wasn't a depression, but it was a really, really bad recession that happened in the 70s, and again that happened in the 80s. So economic recessions, multiple, increase in crime, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm just gonna put increase in crime because that's like a whole class on that. Okay, so this is like what they were talking about, that it emphasizes division more than community. Okay, today the citizens of the United States have come together once more because of armed conflict and enemy attack. Terrorism has led to devastation and unity. And so what you know that they're alluding to 9/11, or reference to 9/11. So terrorism has led to devastation and unity. And again, it's this idea that when tragedy strikes, we unite. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click comments, but I'm also going to highlight that because we did before as well. Yet, even in 1994, hold on, let me make sure that, okay, yes. Yeah, I wanted, because there's a video that I show you around here, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't do that without you. So yet, even in 1994, the overwhelming majority of those surveyed by the National Opinion Research Center agreed with this statement. Okay, so people agreed with this statement. The U.S. is a unique country that stands for something special in this world. Awesome. One of the things that it stands for is this vexing. Vexing means troubling, annoying, even. Is this vexing notion that a great nation can consist entirely of refugees from other nations. Again, not just refugees, also enslaved people and undocumented people. Refugees mean that someone is fleeing from one nation to another. There's a specific definition for refugee. Okay, people can be on like the Bracero program of the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. What it would do is that it would bring Mexican workers into the U.S., for example. It would spray them down with all these chemicals, and then they would work in the fields, and they would get paid for the season in which they were working. And then they would go back, and they were kept in horrible housing, horrible conditions, no health care. If something happened to them, they wouldn't be, the treatment medically was not very good, and many of them were just sent back to Mexico with their ailment, or with their with the accident that may have happened to them. But the Bracero program that we had in America for many decades, it thrived on undocumented Mexicanos. It thrived on that. And then it's like they would come, they would work the fields, and then they would kick them back out. So it's not just refugees. It's also, you know, I want to make sure to point this out because we always want to acknowledge who built this country, on whose back this country was built. And it's not just people that emigrated over from Europe. It's not just refugees from other nations. It's also enslaved people or the descendants of enslaved people. And it's also undocumented people. Okay? That is absolutely 100% worth mentioning. It must. And so, here, one of the things that it stands for is this vaccine notion. I want to go ahead and I want to actually include this quote. I'm going to put 1994 National Opinion Research Center. Let me just put that. So I feel like we're not putting anything in the Cornell note for that paragraph so far, and we should. National Opinion Research Center, and I want to put the quote. That's the quote. And I also want to put, the other quote that we were just talking about. I have to fix that. It bothers me. That a great nation can consist entirely of refugees from other nations, that people of different and even warring religions and cultures can live, if not side by side, then on either side of the country's Chester avenues. This is just referring to a neighborhood. A New York neighborhood. But it's emblematic. It symbolizes all neighborhoods. Copy that. A great nation can consist entirely of refugees. And because this is not a part of the quote, I need to put a bracket. And enslaved people. Descendants. No, I'm going to put enslaved people. Undocumented people. And both of their descendants. Like Dr. Jeffries. And because it's not part of the quote, you put it in bracket. Can then live on either side of the neighborhood. Okay? End quote. That is the whole quote. Change the font because it bothers me. There you go. Faced with this diversity, there is little point in trying to isolate anything remotely resembling a national character. But there are two strains of behavior that, however tenuously, abet the concept of unity. And then that's where we leave off. Okay? So, it's this part right here. Anything remotely resembling a national character. And ultimately, what she's saying here is, there is no point in trying to pin the United States down to one kind of way of being American, because it is so diverse and so many different people from all religions, from all nationalities, think I copied it. So when she says national character, there is no point in trying to pin the United States down to one way of being American. I'm just going to break this down a little bit. There you go. It is so, there you go. It is so diverse, and so many different people from all nationalities, ethnicities, races, and cultural backgrounds built this country. So there's no point in trying to have one kind of way of being American. And then she says, but there are two strains of behavior that abet the concept of unity. Okay? There are two types of thinking and behaving that undermine the concept of unity in America. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy and comment, because we want to see what the two things are next class. Okay? So in case the Wi-Fi does not work tomorrow, we have our lesson. Okay, what abets the concept of unity? All right. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to close this out. You know, we did 22 or 23 really, you know, for at least for period 6, from the WASP and the Cambodians all the way to abetting the concept of unity. So just to show you, we finished this paragraph right here, and then we finished paragraph 4 of page 1. We did paragraph 1 of page 2, and we did paragraph 2 of page 2. Okay, and that was an hour and 22 minutes, and our class is an hour and 30 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and close out. If you watch this, then you have your entire lesson for the day, and that way, like, we won't fall behind just because of the Wi-Fi at school. Okay, so I'm going to make sure to upload this. You know, I have to download it. I'm going to upload it, and please pay attention to any posts that I make on Remind, and please pay attention to any posts that I make on your stream, because I'm going to be giving you guys more information in the coming days regarding the physical return of school. It is your responsibility to look at the October 1st post that I made for Google Classroom. And I just want to say, if we are not done with the annotations yet, please do not unenroll from a particular class, because you will lose your work. You will lose your work. Okay? So if I haven't put in the grade for something yet, if we haven't done a particular assignment yet, please don't unenroll from the class that you were in. Just go ahead and enroll into your new class. Your Google Classroom codes are here, and your Remind codes are here. Okay? All right. I really hope that I get to, you know, teach you online in the next couple of days, and that, you know, you don't have to watch this video. But either way, I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and you know, rest up, because it's gonna get a little crazy. All right, bye.